Welcome to the lesson on the nervous system introduction. In this lesson we're going to introduce the nervous system. We'll talk about receptors, effectors, and how nerves work. We'll talk about stimulus and response. And we'll talk about how a signal gets from one end of a neuron to the other and then to the next neuron beyond that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Nervous systems are a means of communicating what is happening externally to the internal systems. This requires three parts. We have receptors, which pick up the stimulus. These would, of course, be our sense organs. We'll have a whole nother lesson on those. We have the effectors, which respond to the stimulus, and these would either be glands or muscles. And we have nerves, which connect the receptors and the effectors. Let's talk about some examples. Let's suppose by mistake you put your hand on a hot stove. The stimulus would be the hot stove. The receptor would be the pain sensors on your hand, and the effector would be your biceps with the response to retract your arm. Let's suppose you have a Thanksgiving meal that's been cooked in your house. The stimulus is the smell of that delicious meal. The receptor are your olfactory senses. The effector are your salivary glands. And the response, of course, is that it causes you to salivate. Let's suppose you run across a large hungry bear while you're walking in the woods. The stimulus would be the large hungry bear. The receptor would be your eyes. The effector would be your adrenal glands. And the response would be produce adrenaline. Okay, so in each of these you can see which one was the stimulus, which one was the receptor. Notice that that was some kind of sense organ. Which one was the effector, and that it was either a gland or a muscle. Okay, and nerves are what connect those two. All right, let's next take a look at the structure of a neuron. Nerves are made of thousands of cells called neurons. For this, you're going to need the diagram in your blue book on a neuron. Okay, and it should look something like this. So if you need to pause and get your blue book, go ahead and do that and come back when you're ready. Let's go ahead and label these structures. The one labeled number 1 is the cell body. Being the cell body, it of course has a nucleus, just like every other cell does. These structures here, these little branches, are called dendrites, and they are the nerve endings. This structure right through the middle, the thin little structure, is called an axon. This little spot right here is called the Schwann nucleus. This fatty material right here that you see all along here in different sections is called myelin. This structure, where there is no myelin, is called a node of Ranvier. Say it together with me, Ranvier. You get extra credits for adding flair to that. Not really, but it's cool to say. The next structure is called a Schwann Cell. These two structures would be the terminal branches. And these little knobs here at the end are called synaptic knobs. Okay? Now let's talk about how this neuron works. The signal begins in the dendrites at the end of your neuron. Here, depolarization, flipping of charge distribution from the movement of sodium and potassium ions. More to come in that in our next segment here. then proceeds down the axon to the end on the synaptic knobs. Myelinated nerves conduct faster than unmyelinated nerves because the signal is able to jump from one node of Ranvier to the next via a saltatory conduction. Myelinated neurons conduct at about 100 meters per second. That's more than the length of a football field in a second. Unmyelinated ones at only 2 meters per second. Each neuron has a minimum sensitivity. It's called the threshold of the neuron. If the stimulus is weaker than the threshold, the neuron won't fire. This is called the all or nothing response of neurons. Because all neuron signals are identical, the only way to tell them apart is where they end up in the brain. The strength of a stimulus is perceived by how many neurons fire and how frequently they fire. Because neural reset requires energy, the speed of the reset decreases as nerves are repeatedly stimulated. This results in neurofatigue, and this is why a stimulus strength appears to decrease the longer you are exposed to it. Reset takes place in a fraction of a second after depolarization. It requires the sodium-potassium pump to actively transport the ions back to their original concentrations. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to see an animation of that here in a little bit. All right, so now our signal has gone from the dendrites all the way to the synaptic knobs. Now it has to jump from one neuron to another. The space between neurons is called the synapse, where chemicals called neurotransmitters either send the signal on or else block it. This choice is what allows us to modify our responses and either respond or not. There are two kinds. There are excitatory, which cause the next neuron to fire. Examples would include acetylcholine, which works at the neuromuscular junctions, and adrenaline. Another kind are inhibitory. They block the next neuron from firing. Examples here would include serotonin, which is involved in moods, sensory integration, sleep, and dreaming. Endorphins, which are natural painkillers. GABA, which is an input filter. And dopamine. This is involved in consciousness, pleasure perception, emotional stability, and involved in psychological addictions. Now let's take a look at Hank as he goes into details of all this information more in depth.